Mighty Number 9 is one of the most disappointing games in recent memory, possibly of all time. What started as a sob story ended even worse. It's one of the many examples of why folks are far more cautious about Kickstarters than they once were. While Mighty Number 9 was worked on by both Concept and Intinny Creates, the latter has given the series another shot with their own more traditional Mega Man take that people were originally expecting in the first place. Mighty Gunvolt Burst is a significantly longer and expanded sequel to Mighty Gunvolt, a tiny game created to hype Mighty Number 9 originally with some classic retro flair. Burst takes the idea of running with retro graphics and sound and heavily expands on the gameplay concepts from both Mighty Number 9 and Intinny Creates' own series, Azure Gunvolt. Burst has players taking control of two characters, Beck from Mighty Number 9 and Gunvolt from the Azure Gunvolt series. The stories for the two are separate. Beck is in a training simulator that takes place after Mighty Number 9, meanwhile Gunvolt is entered into a robot fighting tournament, not entirely dissimilar to the story of Mega Man 6. The levels and bosses both characters participate in are almost entirely the same, however there are very minor changes late in the game's final stages. Burst has the look and feel of a game that finds itself sandwiched between the 8 and 16-bit eras. It's not taking enough advantage of the colors or techniques introduced from the 16-bit era of consoles, but also has far too many colors and sprites on screen to be strictly 8-bit either. Essentially, this is by no means a faithful representation of either generation of gaming. Of course, this is plainly obvious when you get to the bosses, where different effects for things like speed or fire are introduced that could never have been accomplished on the native systems from this time. Frankly, it's a minor gripe that purists may have trouble overlooking. Yet, I can't call it bad either, because the game is very colorful and distinct, and while far simpler, looks much better than last year's Mighty Number 9. The overall impression you'll get is just average. Good, but not great. The sound echoes the comments from the graphics too. If you're familiar with Mighty Number 9, and chances are you're like me and aren't past the first couple of stages, there's some decent retro renditions of the music in here. Again, not much to really remember, though the boss music is pretty good. The rest is, like the graphics, just average. The average presentation is fortunately broken by the gameplay. Mostly, at least. Mighty Gunvolt Burst plays very similar to the Mega Man series, as you can plainly tell. Levels consist of different themes with enemies and obstacles to jump and shoot before reaching a boss. Defeat the boss, get a power, and move on. Pretty cut and dry. At least, it would be. Burst adds in a few different mechanics to liven things up, the first being the burst mechanic. Getting a burst on an enemy is done by defeating them at a close range, typically point blank. This racks your score higher, allowing you to get higher rankings at the end of each level. Lives are gone, instead counting the number of times you die and deducting that from your final tally. This is a welcome change, since being a Mega Man-esque title, Burst is a fairly challenging game, one that you'll likely get hung up on in certain areas of and will require some time if you're looking to speedrun, which the game does conveniently have a clock to keep track of your time throughout each stage. The burst system, despite it being part of the game's name, isn't really all that exciting. If you're into leaderboards or getting high grades, it may be worth something to you. But for the rest of us who don't care about a game judging your playstyle or think that scores only matter in arcades, you'll likely forget it exists. But that's not all Burst has up its sleeve, to be perfectly clear. Mega Man's claim to fame was the different weapons and powers you'd acquire from defeating bosses. Mighty Gunvolt Burst has this too, but instead of it being a whole power, it's a part you'll unlock for the customization system. See, Burst has a very heavy customization element, where players are essentially making their own weapons to use. These aren't just obtained from bosses either. Levels contain plenty of hidden secrets that require you to poke around and destroy walls, or perform some daring platforming feats to find. The custom weapons run pretty deep too. There's some easy to understand options, like increasing attack power or the size of bullets you shoot, to the way the bullets curve, along with the angle, number of the bullets you can fire at once, and so much more. Beyond just weapons, there's also options for damage reduction, locating secrets, increasing attack power, and again, this is all surface level. Levels contain so much to find and tinker with, it's almost overwhelming the number of options you have. Which, unfortunately, that is where the poor presentation comes back to bite the whole charade in the butt. The menu for choosing your options is clunky and unintuitive, and will require a lot of trial and error to get your weapon exactly how you want it. It doesn't help that a lot of the options are pretty vague and somewhat difficult to understand. You're able to change your weapon at any point, and there are a ton of slots to create multiples, something the game very clearly expects you to do. But wrapping your mind around what works best and what doesn't may seem like more trouble than it's worth. It's also worth noting that while Mega Man has a huge rock, paper, scissors element with bosses and their weaknesses, I couldn't find any clear indication of weaknesses in Mighty Gunvolt Burst. This isn't quite a negative per se, but it feels like the options for different elements and their supposed effects are wasted when they don't make a difference. Still, the way that the customization handles its points, dubbed cost points, makes defeating enemies and scouring these secrets more enticing. Customizing weapons can only be done up to the number of cost points you have. Thus, if you want to add something strong that requires a significant amount of extra cost points, you'll need to collect them from exploring levels or choosing them as one of the different rewards players can select for completing levels. Having multiple rewards requiring multiple completions of levels does give the game some replay value, even if it's a bit on the arbitrary side. While they don't have those Mega Man weaknesses I referred to earlier, the bosses are still very exciting to fight and will keep players on their toes. They do all have their patterns that switch up mid-fight, depending on how much damage they take. Thus, it may take a few tries to get their patterns down pat before destroying them. Probably the most ironic part to Burst is that what it does the very best is dropping the bad from Mighty No. 9. Instead of the tried and true shoot it until it dies, Mighty No. 9 introduced this shoot it only so much then dash into a gameplay that was more frustrating and clunky than any semblance of fun. Burst drops this entirely. The only dashing you do is unlocked and optional, meaning if you see an enemy, shoot it until it dies. There's nothing frustrating about that, and it's infinitely more satisfying as well. Mighty Gunvolt Burst finally gives the Mighty No. 9 series some piece of being pretty damn good. The presentation is lacking for sure, but the gameplay itself is enjoyable and leagues better than the prior title. Burst might not scratch that Mega Man itch entirely, but it's more than enough to wash out the bad taste from last year.